there is a pattern most people never notice until it starts repeating with uncomfortable precision. Different faces, different situations, same emotional outcome. You try to change the external world, your relationships, your opportunities, your financial reality, but somehow the underlying structure remains intact. And this leads to a difficult question. What if you are not attracting random experiences, but consistent reflections, not of what you want, but of what you are aligned with beneath your conscious intentions? The invisible mechanism behind repetition. Most people assume life responds to desire, but in practice, life responds to alignment. Not what you say you want, not what you hope for, but what your internal state continuously broadcasts. Thought patterns, emotional conditioning, identity-level assumptions about what is normal, expected, or inevitable. This is why intention alone is often not enough to shift outcomes. Because intention is surface level, identity is structural, and reality responds to structure. Why resistance strengthens the pattern? When something unwanted appears, the instinct is to reject it, fight it, or mentally push it away. But resistance often contains something subtle, attention, and attention reinforces the signal. The mind begins to orbit the very thing it is trying to avoid, creating a loop where awareness and fear become entangled. Over time, the system does not distinguish between what is feared and what is expected. It only registers intensity, and repeated intensity becomes familiarity. Familiarity becomes repetition. The role of internal identity. At the core of every recurring experience is a silent assumption. This is what happens to me. This assumption is rarely verbalized, but it is deeply encoded through memory, emotion, and past reinforcement. So even when external behavior changes, the internal identity may remain unchanged. And identity always wins over intention, because identity determines what feels natural, and what feels natural determines what is sustained. The paradox of control. The more urgently someone tries to control outcomes, the more they often stabilize the very patterns they are trying to escape. Why? Because control implies lack of trust in the current internal structure. And that lack of trust reinforces tension. Tension reinforces monitoring. Monitoring reinforces attachment. And attachment locks attention into the same feedback loop. What actually changes the pattern? Real change does not begin with force. It begins with observation without identification, noticing the pattern without becoming it, seeing the emotional reaction without merging with it. This creates a separation between awareness and conditioning. And in that separation, something critical becomes possible. Rewiring without resistance. The silent shift, when you stop emotionally reinforcing the old pattern, not by suppression but by non-participation, something subtle begins to happen. The system loses its reinforcement cycle. Old reactions still arise, but they are no longer fed with identity. And without identity, repetition loses stability. This is not immediate transformation. It is structural recalibration. Quiet, gradual, almost unnoticeable at first. The real question. So, the question is not simply, what do I want instead? But rather, what internal state am I repeatedly embodying without awareness? Because what you are experiencing is not random distribution. It is structured reflection. And once the structure changes, the reflection has no choice but to follow. Closing insight. You are not stuck attracting what you don't want because something external is against you. You are experiencing the consistency of an internal system that has not yet been interrupted at its root level. And the moment you stop negotiating with the pattern and start observing it without feeding it, the repetition begins to lose its grip. Not because reality changes first, but but because the source of repetition finally does. There comes a point where insight alone is no longer enough. Understanding the pattern intellectually does not automatically dissolve it. In fact, the mind can become quite skilled at analyzing its own limitations while still operating inside them. It can describe the loop in detail, predict its next cycle, even articulate its origin, and yet remain fully embedded within it. Because the real mechanism is not conceptual, it is participatory. Every time a familiar emotional response arises and is followed by automatic reaction, the system is being reaffirmed. Not because you consciously choose it, but because there is no interruption between stimulus and identity. The response feels like you, so it continues. This is where most change attempts fail. They try to replace content rather than interrupt process. They try to install new thoughts into an unchanged structure, expecting different output from the same circuitry. But the system does not respond to contradiction. It responds to repetition. So even positive thinking can become another layer of the same cycle if it is used as compensation rather than transformation. If it is deployed to cancel discomfort instead of witnessing it, it still reinforces the underlying assumption that certain states must be avoided at all costs. And what you resist, you continue to define. At some point, the real shift begins when the reaction is no longer automatically extended into narrative. There is a gap, subtle at first, where something appears but does not immediately become a story about identity, meaning, or consequence. In that gap, the pattern loses momentum, not because it has been fought, but because it has not been completed. The unfinished reaction cannot fully crystallize into repetition. It dissolves in its own interruption. This is often mistaken for detachment, but it is more precise to call it non-extension. The experience still arises, but it is not prolonged by interpretation. It passes through awareness without being converted into identity reinforcement, and over time, something counterintuitive happens. The same situations begin to lose their emotional charge. Not because the external world has changed, but because the internal response no longer supplies the same fuel. The pattern still appears, but it no longer anchors itself in the system with the same depth. This is where people often misinterpret progress. They expect dramatic external shifts, when in reality the first evidence of change is internal neutrality in situations that previously created intensity. But neutrality is not emptiness. It is unhooking, and unhooking changes selection. It changes perception. It changes what the system considers relevant enough to keep reproducing. Eventually, what once felt unavoidable begins to feel distant, not through effort, but through disuse. The old configuration stops being reinforced simply because it is no longer being inhabited in the same way. And at that point, something very simple becomes visible. You were never attracting isolated events. You were maintaining a frequency of interpretation that organized those events into a repeating structure. When that interpretation is no longer continuously supplied, the structure cannot sustain itself with the same certainty. What replaces it is not immediate perfection or constant positivity. It is space. And in that space, something new is finally allowed to form without being immediately shaped by the old pattern. That is where real change begins, not in what you add, but in what you stop completing. And what becomes most disorienting in this phase is that the external world does not immediately confirm the internal shift. The same types of situations may still appear. Similar conversations, familiar dynamics, recognizable triggers. This creates a subtle tension in perception, as if nothing has changed, despite something fundamentally different already being underway. But the system does not reorganize itself based on sudden discontinuity. It recalibrates through reduced reinforcement. What changes first is not the world, but the interpretive urgency. Where there was once immediate meaning-making, there is now delay. Where there was once automatic emotional consolidation, There is now observation without consolidation. This delay is not passive. It is structural disruption of the old loop, because the old loop depends on speed. Trigger, interpretation, identity reaction, emotional completion, reinforcement. When that sequence is interrupted, even slightly, the loop begins to lose coherence. At first, the mind will attempt to restore it. It will generate explanations, assign significance, attempt to reconnect the broken sequence so that the familiar emotional architecture can resume. This is why old patterns often intensify temporarily when they begin to loosen. The system is trying to regain its former consistency. But if the interruption is maintained, something else begins to emerge. Not suppression, not control, not substitution, a reduction in automatic binding. Experiences begin to remain as experiences rather than becoming identity confirmations. A reaction may arise, but it does not fully consolidate into "this is happening to me" in the usual way. It remains partial, unfinished, unclaimed, and in that unfinished state, it cannot fully reinforce the previous structure. Over time, this creates a quiet redistribution of attention. Energy that was previously consumed by repetition is no longer constantly allocated to maintaining the same interpretive loop. That energy does not disappear. It becomes available again. And what it is used for next is not something the conscious mind fully decides. It is determined by what is no longer being sustained. This is why change often feels less like addition and more like subtraction of compulsion, less like building something new, and more like no longer being internally obligated to continue what was never consciously chosen in the first place. Eventually, a different kind of stability begins to form. Not the stability of rigid identity, but the stability of reduced internal conflict. Fewer automatic oppositions, fewer compulsive reactions, less internal negotiation with experience. And from the outside, this can be misunderstood as passivity. But internally, it is actually increased precision. Less noise means more accurate perception of what is actually occurring, rather than what was previously projected onto it. At that point, attraction, in the way it was originally understood, stops being the right framework altogether. It is no longer about pulling specific experiences toward a fixed identity. It becomes clearer that experience was always responding to a moving internal configuration, one that continuously organized perception, attention, and interpretation into repeating outcomes. When that configuration changes, the repetition is no longer structurally supported, and what replaces it is not control over outcomes. It is a reduction in the unconscious necessity to recreate the same ones, which is why the most significant transformation is often invisible at first, because it does not announce itself as something new being gained. It appears as something old no longer needing to continue. So the real conclusion is not about mastering attraction or decoding reality as something external to be influenced. It is about recognizing the degree to which experience has been filtered through internal repetition, and how much of what seemed inevitable was actually sustained through unexamined continuity. Nothing changes in a single decisive moment where everything flips. That is a narrative the mind prefers because it preserves the idea of control. In practice, the system shifts when reinforcement stops being automatic. And that shift is quiet. It does not require force. It requires continuity of awareness without re-entry into the same cycle. What once felt like a personal pattern begins to reveal itself as a learned structure. And what is learned can persist, but it does not need to be actively maintained once it is seen clearly enough to no longer be unconsciously enacted. From there, the work is not to chase different outcomes, but to stop feeding the old ones through interpretation, reaction, and identity confirmation. What remains is not emptiness in the negative sense, but openness, a less constrained field of response where experience is no longer immediately converted into repetition. And in that space, life is no longer something you are constantly trying to correct. It becomes something you are no longer unconsciously distorting. That is where the cycle truly ends, not with resistance, but with the quiet removal of what was keeping it alive.